Welcome to the Potter Blog site, Friday, August 1st, 2014. Inhalation Ebola. Governments ready for World War Ebola. Yes, Ebola can be spread by inhalation. And yes, the government is preparing for Inhalation Ebola. Just yesterday, the President issued an executive order which allows the Centers for Disease Control to use the guise of infectious pneumonia to quarantine people for Ebola. And today, New York held its largest ever unannounced pandemic response drill. Now, such drills are an effective way to stage logistical pandemic supplies without alerting the public. Now, to understand the risk of inhaled Ebola and why these actions have been taken, consider that 2 American medical missionaries appear to have come down with Ebola just by spraying down their protective clothing with disinfectant. It seems that the disinfectant spray aerosolized the infectious contamination on their protective clothing. Now consider what it means for the spread of Ebola when the people spraying the disinfectant on their protective clothing die from that action. It seems that this information resulted in the CDC issuing guidance to aircraft crews that focuses on suspected Ebola cases spreading by actions as minimal as, quote, talking. CDC's guidance even warns aircraft cleaning crews against using compressed air to clean aircraft, as it will result in the airborne spread of Ebola. Now, it's this airborne potentiality which makes Ebola basically untreatable and unquarantinable in anything but a very few level 4 biosafety facilities. It is a situation which has the potential to bring the majority of zombie apocalypse vignettes into play. Now, the current situation is grave enough to scare the pants off even Pentagon planners. And in that regard, if you're easily frightened or can act without first thinking, now is a good time to stop viewing this video, because we're about to explain the worst case red team scenario. Now the worst case scenario basically is, the act of attempting to treat Ebola victims becomes impossible outside of anything but a very few level 4 safety facilities. When it becomes impossible to decontaminate clothing without facing risk of infection, you have an untenable situation. And this appears to be the situation right now in Africa as international teams evacuate. In fact, there's a headline out on Drudge now that over 100 plus medical workers in Africa have been infected via Ebola. So now, coming to the United States, when the second or third appearances of Ebola in the United States will result in large numbers of people being placed in quarantine under the guise of a viral pneumonia, as is now possible with President Obama's new executive order. They don't actually have to specify Ebola to make these quarantines for Ebola-esque symptoms. Now, here's the thing about the airborne situation and inhalation. Experts will make claims that Ebola is not airborne, while taking ethical solace that inhalation Ebola doesn't meet their technical definition of airborne, even though the outcomes are similar. It's like when former President Clinton got into what the definition of is. It's Clinton speak. They have a very tight definition in their world in which they define airborne. It's very different from what you and I consider airborne. But the fact is that it appears that very minute amounts of Ebola making it into the air is contaminating and infecting people, even if these same people are spraying disinfectant simultaneously. It's the act of the disinfectant hitting the personal protective equipment, aerosolizing the Ebola on that equipment, and when they inhale it, they come down with it. So, such subterfuges are undertaken to avoid panic and uncontrolled disease spread. If such quarantine fails to stop the spread, then whole cities are quarantined and travel is shut down. We're starting to see that in Africa right now. Now, there's a question whether or not there are any current ghost villages in Africa as a result of this. That'll be a key indicator to look for that things have gotten even worse. Now, at this point, no person with Ebola, once all this has happened, no person with Ebola can expect treatment. And anyone with a fever and their direct associates can expect it to be rounded up and placed in isolation with Ebola victims. And this even becomes even more troublesome if this occurs during flu season or the winter, when the risks are such that any person with a fever would be a suspected Ebola victim. And from this point onward, if the spread of the disease is not stopped and death rates remain over 50%, governments enact zombie apocalypse types rules, as any potential victims are too high risk to keep alive. Now, of course, none of this means that the worst case scenario will happen with Ebola. It just means that governments are making contingencies to do what they believe is required under the worst case. And that alone should scare the crap out of you. Now, here's our take on the situation. We don't expect Ebola to become zombie apocalyptic. Our take is that the powers that be are currently more afraid of the damage from public panic than from the actual spread of the disease, at least here in the United States. Unfortunately, this sets up a situation where the desire not to be truthful with the public places the public at risk and actually increases the probability of the worst case scenario playing out. What the situation means is that wise people will realize that public health communications could rapidly go from, hey, everything's okay, to shut up and do what you are told. One should not expect to be able to make effective last-minute logistical actions if things go bad. Now, we've documented all of our sources here of the things we've mentioned. We suggest you go through them. But again, if things go bad, public information will operate in a step function. It'll be everything's okay, to all of a sudden you'll notice things are not okay, and then the news will come out that shut up and do what you are told.